When we're speaking of the sacrament of marriage, it is also something that's rooted in really the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament, specifically Ephesians chapter 5, in that discussion that Paul has about wives and husbands. And a lot of people avoid this particular reading for a wedding because it speaks of wives being subjected to their husbands, when in fact they don't read the very first line that says wives and husbands should be submissive to one another, as if to the Lord. And so there's meant to be a respect there. But it's in that particular passage that Paul says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh," where he is quoting Genesis, the creation of man and woman. And so from the very beginning, there's a recognition that God has called man and women to enter into a special relationship that we've called marriage, where they provide for one another and then also for the propagation of children. And he says that this is a great mystery, that I am applying it to Christ and to the church. Now, there needs to be a little bit of background to this from the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, one of the ways in which people would describe, the prophets would describe the relationship between God and the people of Israel was by use of the marriage covenant. That just as two people were called to be faithful to one another, just as they were to provide for each other's needs and so on, so God was faithful to his people always, and God loved his people and provided for his people always. And so the prophets would begin to describe that covenant relationship that God had with the people of Israel by using the marriage covenant. And in fact, in Hosea, we find that reflected, and also in the Song of Songs. And the Song of Songs is really an erotic love poem about two lovers deeply loving one another. And you could even question why that would even appear in the scriptures at all, this love poem between two people, except that the people of Israel recognize in that love poem a way of expressing God's deep and abiding and passionate love for his people and the desire to remain in covenant with them. Calling in the book of Hosea, of course, is about the prophet whose wife has actually left him and joined with others, and yet he keeps coming back to his wife and calling her back to himself. Just like the people had broken the covenant and had moved away from their relationship with God, but God keeps calling them back to himself. So with that as a background, then Paul recognized that marriage was a sign of Christ's covenant relationship with his church. And so just as a husband and wife provide for one another and are faithful to each other and are meant to be there together without being separated, thus Christ is with his church. So the church has always looked to this particular passage because it says that this is a great mystery, and we talked about that a little bit. The word for sacrament was originally mysterion, which is a Greek word referring to the way in which the sacrament points to and makes present to us a reality of Christ's grace at work in our own lives. And so Paul uses that word, which is later mysterion, which is later translated as sacrament, to say that the relationship between husband and wife points to and makes present to us a sense of how Christ is related to his church. And so all of the activities and actions of self-giving that are involved in married life are meant to be a sign that points to and makes present to us the self-giving of Christ continually for his church. And of course this is permanent because Jesus said that I will be with you always until the end of time. And so the expectation, of course, is that marriage itself will be permanent, and it will be faithful, and it will be self-giving for the good of the parties, and also for the sake of their children that come forth from that marriage, if a couple is able to have children. So, in the end, we recognize that marriage is rooted in scriptures, and it's a reflective of God's covenant love with his people, and also Christ's deep and abiding love for his church.